All right, welcome to the very first episode of Global Power Shifts. This is a new podcast exploring how the world is changing at a very rapid speed. We'll be exploring how technology, globalization, demographic shifts, social changes, progress, and environmental issues are quite literally reshaping our world. These changes, they bring opportunities, but also significant challenges, and they create risks along the way. One of the significant changes the world is facing when it comes to geopolitics is, of course, the re-election of Donald Trump, who will be inaugurated on January 20th in Washington, D.C. And I had the pleasure of hosting a fireside chat with Charles Myers a couple of weeks ago here in Dubai. He's a fascinating figure, the chairman and founder of Signum Global Advisors. He advises senior political figures in the US and clients around the world when it comes to geopolitics. So we're very lucky to have Charles with us here today on this premiere episode. So Charles, there's big changes that are afoot in Washington. How do you anticipate that the second Trump administration will be different from the first one? It's a completely different world that he's entering as he returns to the White House.
Yeah, look, I think the two main differences really are that Trump 2.0 the United States is going to be much more protectionist. He really does view tariffs and trade policy as a very effective tool to help do several things, including address trade imbalances that the United States has with other countries. Secondly, to use as a threat to try to force countries, or in the case of Europe, the EU, the bloc, to do things that he wants. And then third, as an important source of revenue to help pay for tax cuts and other parts of the domestic agenda. So I'd say one of the biggest differences is that the United States will be more protectionist. The second difference is that the world is far more complicated. There are two active wars today that he's inheriting. I do think he will be a game changer in helping to possibly end both, and I will get into that. But I think that's the other key difference, is that the world outside of the U.S. is more complicated, and therefore I think his foreign policy challenges will be greater this term.
And do you also think that he's changed as a person? You know, we've seen those one assassination attempt on Trump, and then another that was thankfully stopped at a very early stage. Is he the same man, or do you think that he's changed significantly?
No, I think at his core, he's exactly the same. I think that the difference is he's got 4 years of experience being president, so he's a more experienced executive and head of state. But I think at his core, he has not changed at all. If anything, I think he's going to double down in some ways on certain things that a lot of Americans are not going to like. So no, I don't think he's a changed or improved person. I think he's just a more experienced one.
And the foreign policy that he inherits from Biden, it's quite tricky. No wars were started during the first Trump administration that the U.S. got involved in. It's been a very mixed bag for Biden when it comes to foreign policy. You know, from the chaotic pullout of Afghanistan to the conflict in Ukraine, and now the situation in Israel and Gaza. How do you sort of assess Biden's foreign policy legacy?
I think his legacy, as with all U.S. presidents, his foreign policy legacy is mixed, right? I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster and deserves to be, labeled that, and he should be held accountable for it. I think that
even though it was initiated by Trump.
It was. The original deal to pull out was a deal that was negotiated by President Trump. It's just that Biden had to execute it, and the execution of the withdrawal was very poor and very badly planned, I think. The Middle East, I would say that looking back, there could be an argument. One could argue that if the United States had been more supportive of Israel, that the conflict might have ended sooner. I know that's a pretty sensitive topic, but Biden has been one of the main forces that's been slowing Israel down, even though it doesn't always feel that way. Whereas Trump is going to really speed things up, and we've already seen that with the hostage deal that was just announced. That Trump really deserves credit. On the more positive side for Biden, though, the United States, under his leadership, was able to rally the EU or NATO and some other allies to step in very quickly to defend Ukraine and really hold the line with Russia. So I think that, again, as with any U.S. president, the track record is mixed. And I would say, lastly, where Biden will get and deserves credit is strengthening some of our alliances and relationships with key allies around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific.
And you touched a little bit briefly there on Ukraine. It's been a massive challenge for Europe, obviously, and he's promised to end that conflict on day one. We know that's not going to happen, and even Trump realizes that it's going to be a little bit more challenging than that. How do you see the U.S. and the Europeans working together to bring an end to the conflict and some kind of negotiated settlement?
Yeah, I do think that President Trump is a game changer in so many ways, including with regards to the conflict in Ukraine. He's walked back his 24-hour solution to now 6 months, which I think is, more realistic, but actually still probably a bit optimistic. But I think at some point, but 6 to 9 months from now, and I think certainly, before the end of this year, President Trump, through both, carrots and sticks, is going to get Putin to the table. The challenge isn't getting Ukraine to the table, because the challenge is getting the Russians, because Russia's winning and time is on Putin's side. And I think that ultimately what President Trump, and with the help of Europe and other allies, I think Turkey will be a key intermediary as well. I think the Emirates will. I think a number of countries in the Gulf will also be very important in helping to ultimately engineer a solution. But I think what it looks like is a ceasefire, not a peace agreement. Russia probably gets to keep most of, if not all of what they already have occupied of Ukraine. And I think there has to be some sanctions relief for Russia in order to really get them to agree to a ceasefire. So maybe financial services, commercial aviation, even possibly the oil price cap, at least will all be on the table for negotiation. And then in exchange for that, Ukraine does not get NATO membership, but some guarantees. And very importantly, the reconstruction of Ukraine can begin. So I am optimistic. I think Trump will help end the war this year, or at least end the hostilities this year. If Harris had won, I think the war would have continued well into next year with really an open-ended, who knows when it would have ended.
And Marco Rubio, he's obviously a seasoned, I want to say diplomat, but that's not true, but he's a seasoned politician who's dealt with foreign relations for a very long time. What do you see him adding as Secretary of State?
I think he's a very qualified Secretary of State. He was on Senate Foreign Relations for a very long time. He's really built his career in the Senate on some of the trickier parts of foreign policy, and I think will be a very, very strong top diplomat for the United States, whether it's negotiating in difficult places or helping drive policy towards countries like Venezuela, other parts of Latin America, etc. So I actually think I'm very optimistic. I think he's going to do a great job.
Does this mean that the Europeans will have to step up? I mean, there's been a lot of discussions around increasing defense spending. We know that Trump wants a better deal when it comes to NATO. So how do you see that shift taking place?
Yeah, Europe is going to have to spend more on their own defense. They know it. They've already been doing it. And now that Trump has won again, he will force the remaining members of NATO that are not spending 3% of their GDP on defense. He will force them increasingly to do that through threats, through tariffs, through other punitive measures. He's now threatening or suggesting that the NATO members need to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. That's not going to happen. I think that's, again, a threat and a negotiating position. But in the end, Europe is going to spend more on defense. It's not going to be necessarily connected to prolonging the war in Ukraine. It's just a requirement, literally a requirement of NATO membership, and Trump has been absolutely right on this issue. So I think it is going to happen over the next couple of years, and Trump is going to enforce it. Biden didn't really push it.
And obviously, you have a lot of discussions with clients and politicians in Europe as well. Are you sensing a lot of anxiety from leaders on the continent now that things are about to change?
Yes, especially in the EU, because of all of the negative outcomes of the US election. I would say the most negative is actually for the European Union. The US-EU bilateral is about to really deteriorate. The relationship will deteriorate for many reasons. First, Trump has always been anti-Europe. He was pro-Brexit famously, if you remember, very publicly pro-Brexit. Secondly, he's complained for years that Europe doesn't trade fairly. They don't spend enough on their own defense. And there's a perception they may want to prolong the war in Ukraine a little bit longer. And all of those are going to be sources of tension in the bilateral. And on top of that, we're about to slap Europe with some pretty heavy tariffs on European autos, steel and aluminum, possibly luxury goods, possibly around Airbus or parts for Airbus. So on almost every level, the US-EU relationship, I think, is going to become far more complicated, and the direction of travel is net negative. So yes, they are worried in Brussels, they are worried in Paris and in Berlin and other major capitals. The one person in Europe that's extremely happy, thrilled, in fact, that Trump has won is Viktor Orban in Hungary, because they're very close. I think Orban becomes a slightly more powerful voice in Europe. I know my European friends disagree with that, but I think he will be de facto. And the other, and I'd say that's a negative, the more constructive voice for Europe increasingly will be Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She and Trump already have some very good chemistry. She's only the third head of state to fly to Mar-a-Lago after our election to meet with Trump. She's doing all the right things, and I think could be a very constructive intermediary on behalf of Europe with the Trump administration.
What does Trump ultimately want when it comes to Europe? If he has the opportunity to kind of reshape the EU in, I almost want to say his own image, but how is he looking to shift that relationship beyond, ending the conflict in Ukraine and getting the EU to step up its defense spending? Is it purely transactional?
Yeah, it's very transactional, and what I always try to explain to people in Brussels, especially because when I'm there, they're very frustrated with President Trump, saying we're some of your most important allies. Why do you want to punish us or penalize us, whether it's on trade or other? And what I try to explain to them is that President Trump has always viewed our allies as economic adversaries at best. Trump views the world economically in zero-sum terms. The United States can only do better at the expense of other countries, including our allies. So what he wants from Europe is for them to start trading more fairly. I'll give you a quick example. The average tariff on a US car into Europe is 30%, 30. The average tariff on a a European car into the US is 3%. That asymmetry is deeply unfair, and Trump is right on this. The United States has been footing the bill for a large part of Europe's security since World War II. That needs to also change. So, in fact, I would argue objectively, President Trump is right on these issues. It's just that the way he goes about it is through threats, and ultimately will be through tariffs and other punitive measures. So I think that what he really wants is, basically for the United States to be able to do better while Europe spends more money on their own side and on their own defense, for example.
And obviously there's a side story within this as well, the fact that the US economy is doing quite well while the European economy seems to be falling behind.
And this is also not only President Trump, but really every American president wants every head of state wants their country to do much better and better than most. And the era of American exceptionalism will continue under Trump, at least in the near term. Partly because we're subsidizing foreign direct investment into the U.S. with our Inflation Reduction Act, our CHIPS Act, and the industrial policy that we're engaged in, some of which is also the protectionism. But at the end of the day, what the Trump administration will want is a continuation of what we saw under Biden, which is foreign direct investment in the U.S. at a much higher rate than average, because we do look as a country and as an economy much better than most parts of the world. Again, we're also subsidizing some of it, and again, in this zero-sum view of the world, the way that the United States benefits there is at the expense of Europe, and also companies reallocating capex not only away from Europe but even away from Asia into the U.S. So what he really wants is for the U.S. economy to continue to do incredibly well. He's inheriting a very strong economy, and by extension, a very strong U.S. equity market.
And if you were advising clients in Europe on how to best deal with Trump 2.0, what would you tell them in order for them to get a better outcome?
Yeah, so what we've been saying to our clients, especially our corporate clients, as well as if they're a quasi-government, like a sovereign wealth fund, and this is our advice not only to European clients, but in clients in the Gulf and elsewhere around the world, is first, and this was our advice on November 6th, the day after the U.S. election, the minute Trump won, was put together a pretty aggressive marketing campaign with really clear data showing how big your investments are in the United States, whether again it's you as a country, you as a company, how much have you invested in the United States, and relatedly, how many U.S. jobs can you ultimately connect to those investments. And as part of that marketing effort with the Trump transition team, and from Monday onward, the Trump administration, is in addition to highlighting that, we X country or company have done the following, we are committed to investing even more into the United States. Put a number around it. Talk about where in the United States, how many jobs you think that might create. This is going to be the most transactional, literally the most transactional administration in American history. And it's also, we're back into the world of very personal politics. And so President Trump and his team will really respond well to those kind of efforts and outreach and data from foreign investors into the U.S., especially ones that are already here and committed to doing more.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I think that's also one of the reasons why he's quite popular as a leader here in the Gulf, a part of the world that's also quite transactional. But if we look at the wider Middle East, we touched on it briefly there, Israel-Gaza, obviously there's new leadership in Syria, and Lebanon is rebuilding as well. I mean, do you think the Middle East will actually pose perhaps even a greater challenge than Ukraine? All eyes are on Ukraine, but the challenge that's taking place in this part of the world is momentous.
Absolutely, and I'm going to answer that. But one other quick thing I was going to mention on President Trump, just more broadly on this issue of companies and countries engaging with him and his administration. If you can get to him directly, even better. But he goes in literally every meeting, every negotiation, every situation with two overarching objectives in his mind. Right. The first is what's in it for the United States. America first. And you can't really fault him for that, right? He is the head of state. What's in it for America, for the United States? And the second overarching objective in his mind is, how does it make me look? So, I always tell our clients, focus on those two issues and you'll do really well with Trump. On the Middle East, I'm actually very optimistic because, again, on the theme of Trump being a disruptor and his election being a game changer in many ways, domestically for the U.S. economy, very positive. War in Ukraine ending sooner than it otherwise would have, and for the Middle East as well. This hostage deal, I know Biden wants to take credit for it, but the truth is it was the Trump team that essentially forced Netanyahu to agree to two things that they were dead against in Israel, which was first, a ceasefire without all of the hostages out at the same time, and secondly, releasing far more Palestinians and others from Israel's own jails. Those are two conditions that Netanyahu was dead against and Trump forced. So Trump does deserve credit for this deal. And I think that what we're going to see, to answer your question, more broadly for the Middle East, is the Trump team very likely putting both sanctions, higher sanctions and tariffs or other on Iran, trying to put even more pressure on Iran to try to get them to do two things: agree to fund less terrorism in the region, or less of their proxies that are hostile, and secondly, get them to the table ultimately into some kind of agreement and bring them back into the fold a bit diplomatically. The other, and that's a more medium-term goal. The shorter-term goal is ultimately to stabilize even further the Middle East and help expand the Abraham Accords, which was Trump's number one foreign policy achievement, a huge achievement, and ultimately have Saudi and even the remaining countries normalize relations with Israel. Of course, it's going to take time. None of this is easy, but if any U.S. president can do it, it will be President Trump. So barring some short-term escalation with Iran, and Israel may even decide to hit Iran one more time militarily, maybe take out more of the nuclear program in the short term with Trump's approval. I think that looking beyond that, again, short-term escalation, we actually will see an extended period of stability and prosperity in the Middle East. And all the ruling families want that. It's the right thing. The United States wants it, and it's good for the world.
On the question of Iran, I mean, what is the state of those proxies that Tehran has in the region? Because it certainly seems like they've lost most of the influence that they had before, and then also on extending the Abraham Accords. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he's always talked about requiring essentially an irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. Do you think that's compatible with the current leadership in Israel?
So I think on the first part, Iran is the weakest it's been since the regime came to power in 1979, but they're not so weak that it's on the verge of collapse. So we don't expect regime change as a result of even President Trump winning. But the proxies also, as you mentioned, are incredibly weak. Hezbollah is the weakest at this point. They've really been decimated by Israel. I wouldn't be surprised to see Hezbollah from here over time evolve more into a legitimate political party in Lebanon because they've been so weakened militarily. We'll see. Hamas much weaker as well. I think they'll regroup mainly in Turkey, a little bit, in Qatar, but the Houthis are more of an irritant. So, Iran is increasingly isolated militarily, and I think also their economy is going to get hit harder by U.S. sanctions, more aggressive U.S. sanctions under Trump. So I think that the possibility of really forcing Iran to the table is there. It's going to take maybe a year. On the other question, MBS has walked back part of his absolute requirement of a two-state solution or path to a two-state solution, as a condition for normalizing relations with Israel. I think that what will happen ultimately, and this again will take time, I don't want to suggest any of this is easy, but I do think that Israel and Saudi will normalize relations. The Abraham Accords will be expanded to include that because the framework already exists. There's no need to create a new one. And as part of that expansion of the Accords, a commitment towards working towards a two-state solution. I think it'll be a little bit of a fudge, to be honest with you, but there will be some commitment in there so the deal can actually happen. So again, none of this is easy. It will take time. But, and I think the role of the Emirates in this is going to be key. The Emirates increasingly is going to just continue to develop as a global financial center, both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but also a real center for innovation in technology, in AI, a much more diversified economy that's already well underway, already been happening, and just continue to see that really develop. And so, for all of these countries in the Gulf, the number one objective is stability and prosperity. And the only way to do that is ultimately to bring peace, including some sort of deal with Iran.
And the fact that the UAE is now a member of BRICS, do you think that's likely to create a little bit of friction with Trump?
Yeah, look, I think that BRICS is interesting, the global south more broadly, but the truth is, anytime that they have a summit or meetings and they talk about, their own trading bloc, their own currency, all of that is wishful thinking. It's not that these aren't important countries at all. It's just that, the dominant economy in the world is the United States. You have to deal with the U.S. The United States is also the world leader in technology. We also are a country that most countries want to be aligned with in an event where China someday does become imperialist or quite hostile. So I think that, the BRICS are interesting, but I'm not sure they're going to really be able to exert that much power, independent power or influence. I think the player and the country that will much more so on its own is Saudi Arabia. Under Trump, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is going to improve dramatically. Under Biden, it had gotten better because Saudi's been quite helpful in the defense of Israel in many ways, and more behind the scenes even than's often reported. But MBS and Saudi will become increasingly not only a regional military power, but ultimately, I would say, a global power in terms of influence and other. I think they're on a path to that. I think under Trump that accelerates. And then again, the success of that path ultimately falls on MBS and what happens domestically.
And Saudi Arabia, of course, was actually invited to join BRICS, but they've so far not accepted that. Do you think they've sort of had the relationship with Trump in the back of their minds as part of that decision to hold off for now?
Absolutely. I think the decision by Saudi not to join BRICS was a clear signal to Trump that they want to deal directly with Trump and that's the more important relationship, the U.S. Very smart.
And obviously the Middle East, I mean, it's not just a place where you work and where you're setting up your business. You have a personal relationship to this part of the world as well. Can you just touch on that briefly and how you've seen it change on a personal level over the years?
Yeah, so I'm an unusual American in that I grew up in Libya. My father was in the oil industry. I was in Libya for the first 14 years of my life. And so, I've always had a very strong interest and affinity with the Middle East, with that part of the world. And then a big part of my academic work was on the Middle East. And then professionally, I've spent a lot of time as a banker in the Middle East, and now we have an office in Dubai, and it's our fastest growing client segment. So, and in fact, I was in the Gulf 5 times last year, including 5 times in Saudi. So there's so much happening that, as you know, because you're based there, the level of innovation, the level of in both outbound, but especially increasingly inbound investment into these countries is very exciting, and also strategically. We have the United States, very important military bases and a very important military presence in almost every one of these countries. And so not only is there a huge interest in further economic ties and co-investment between the countries and the U.S., there's a very critical national security interest that will only become more important, I think, over time.
Trump's also had some pretty strong rhetoric on Canada, Greenland, and also the Panama Canal. One can imagine that he's serious about Greenland and particularly Panama as well. What opportunity do you see for the U.S. to sort of enhance its relationship with Canada, but crucially build on the security relationship that already exists in Greenland? There's been a lot of interesting reactions from Denmark, and obviously there's an election coming up as well in Greenland. So you can see an opening whereby that island nation could potentially perhaps not be part of the U.S., but certainly have a much
stronger
relationship with America.
Absolutely. I think, it's always interesting with President Trump because he likes to throw these, statements and some ideas out there that just sound so incredibly, far-fetched. And what I always say on President Trump with these issues is, try to look through some of the hyperbole and the noise and focus on what he's actually really saying, because in part because of the outsized personality and again some of the controversies around him and the way he communicates, what gets lost in a lot of that noise is actually how strategic he really is. So on Canada, he doesn't want Canada to be the 51st state. What he really wanted to do is stick the knife into Trudeau and make sure that party loses and the Conservatives come back to power. That's what Trump really wants, because I think he thinks, and rightly so, we'll probably have an even better relationship with Canada. He also wants to extract a few other things from Canada, maybe to get a few wins on the trade side outside of the USMCA. But it's really to kind of kick Canada when it's down, when there's a political vacuum, and also ensure that Trudeau, who isn't stepping down, but that Trudeau's party does not win the election. I think that was lot of that was. On Panama, it was also very straightforward. The Trump team believed that Panama is giving China preferential passage, rates of passage at the expense of American shipping and American companies. I don't know if it's true or not, but if that's true, I think that's what Trump's trying to address. We're not going to invade Panama. The Greenland is even more interesting. We're not going to buy or invade Greenland. What Trump wants instead is to negotiate directly with Greenland to the extent he can. It's unclear because they're somewhat owned by, controlled by, I should say, Denmark. But what he really wants is two things. More exclusive access to the critical minerals in Greenland, again, at the expense of China, meaning pushing China out. And then secondly, an agreement that we can really expand and increase our military presence in Greenland by negotiating again with them and the Danes, because we have one of our most important military bases in the world in Greenland. It's a bit under the radar, but as part of that,
Trump, World War II.
Yes, absolutely. And what Trump also wants, again, as part of the second piece, the national security piece, is for Greenland and Denmark to agree to restrict water passage of Chinese and Russian ships north of Greenland and around Greenland. So it's far more strategic what Trump really wants, but the way he negotiates is he throws out these sort of really kind of somewhat either surprising statements, but in the end, looking through that, what he wants is actually very much, is very serious and very much in the interest of the United States.
And on Greenland, I mean, obviously this is something that's been discussed in the past, but it's accelerated now because of climate change, which is shifting that whole part of the world. Can you talk about that and the competition that the U.S. sees between, I guess, itself, Russia, and China?
Yeah, look, I think control ultimately of the Arctic, and by that I mean who has the larger military presence and the ability to move more freely through the waterways there. Because of climate change, access and passage is becoming easier generally. I think that's the concern for the United States, that if Russia especially and China have a lot more, the ability to build up a much larger presence in the Arctic, it is a direct threat to North America, Canada, and the United States. So I think it's really more about that. I think, as I said, it's very strategic on the part of Trump's team. He was talking about it in Trump 1. And then there's so I do think it's very real, the interest and the intent, and it is a serious military objective of the United States. But there's the other part of it, which is the nationalism and the fact that, when you tell Americans we're going to buy Greenland, it sounds kind of good. You know what I mean? Like for the average American, it's about the United States expanding and getting bigger. As you know, the Greenlanders and the Danes are not going to sell Greenland.
And China, it's been a tough few years, obviously, in that country following the pandemic. The economy is not what it used to be, and now we have these tariffs looming as well. What do you think the likeliest scenario is for the relationship between the U.S. and China going forward? Because it seemed like it got a little bit better under Biden, but not better enough in order for that to boost the relationship or have the relationship go back to what it was in the past.
Yeah, so I think on U.S.-China, in the short term, meaning the next 6 months, the bilateral, U.S.-China bilateral will get better. President Trump just did a call yesterday with President Xi, very constructive call. There will be a summit. They are going to meet. And therefore, on the tariff question, I think that we will be more gradualist on China. I think we're going to hit Europe first, harder, and then more gradually on China, because what Trump wants to do is to leave some room to negotiate with China, to sit down and actually negotiate. Trump wants China to agree, first and foremost, to honor the phase one trade deal, which China has reneged on. That's a relatively easy win, but also on a variety of other issues. So I think in the near term, U.S.-China actually could be more constructive. Having said that, we're going to only over time impose more and more tariffs because of the very large trade imbalance and trade deficit. And then secondly, we will continue to try to contain China technologically through our tech export restriction list and other measures, including convincing our allies to join that. And then tension around Taiwan will only increase. So Near term, I'm more constructive on U.S.-China. Looking out a year and beyond, the direction of travel in the bilateral is going to be net negative. China is our biggest national security threat. It will remain our biggest national security threat, and we will continue to do everything we can to exacerbate their problems and accelerate their decline.
And obviously, Biden, he's getting ready now to hand over to Trump. I should, of course, say that we're recording this on January 17th. He did warn about an oligarchy in one of his final days in the White House. How much of a concern do you think that will be going forward, particularly with people like Elon Musk, obviously playing a role in this administration?
Yeah, I think President Biden's right. We are, we already are an oligarchy in a way in the United States. It's just a bit more subtle than in other countries. And now with Trump, it'll be much more overt, out in the open, and on steroids is how I'm describing it. The way to think about Trump, too, in a way, is it's going to be the most transactional administration in American history. It is also going to be the most corrupt. We should call it what it is. We can say that it'll be full of conflicts of interest, but let's call it what it is. It's going to be very corrupt. Elon will be a part of it. At the end of the day, what I've been saying to some of our clients is follow the family, follow the Trump family. Don Jr.'s just joined a bunch of boards. The Trump is incredibly pro-crypto. The Trump family have their own token. They're cutting deals on the real estate side as a family and as a company all over the world. Just follow the family. And it's not, the reason I say follow the family is the family will be out in front of some of the policy making, right? So, in the end, it's going to be incredibly transactional. And those closest, not only the family, but people like Elon and other very large donors, for example, are also going to be beneficiaries of more government contracts, et cetera. I think Elon might be able to buy TikTok. So, it is what it is. On Elon more specifically, I would just say very quickly, the risk there is I don't think there's enough room for those two egos, for Trump and Musk, to really coexist for too long. I give them 6 months, maybe 9, and that breakup is coming. The challenge for Musk, in a way, I would argue, or shareholders in any of his companies, the public or private ones, is if you fall out with Trump, really bad things happen. It's very personal. If you fall out with Biden or George Bush or Reagan, we're a country of laws, we'll follow process. With Trump, it's the opposite. Very bad things can happen, and Musk has $15 billion of government contracts for his companies. So I think Musk is playing a slightly dangerous game. There's nothing wrong with supporting a president and being close to him. It's just that Musk is so incredibly close and exerting so much power. And I'll give one quick example. And sorry to digress on a tangent, but Musk has had a falling out very publicly on Twitter with Nigel Farage in the UK. Farage is one of Trump's closest allies, literally, or friends and supporters and allies. So when you're Musk and you're as wealthy, the wealthiest American, you think that in a way rules don't apply to you, and part of that is possibly crossing the line with Trump. And I think that's going to happen increasingly, and we'll watch that relationship. But overall, we're back in the realm of very transactional politics, very personal politics. And I think that one of the things I'm absolutely certain of is the wealthiest Americans will be a lot wealthier 4 years from now. So I think the verdict is out. I sit here this morning, just literally 2 days before inauguration, as an American who's on the other side of this election, but very optimistic. I think Trump and his team are coming in. By the way, with the exception of 2 or 3 people, this is a really high quality cabinet. It'll be a high functioning technocratic U.S. administration, and they're going to do some very positive things for the U.S. economy and in foreign policy. We should all give them the benefit of the doubt. So I'm very optimistic here. Let's see how they do.
Yeah, and whether you're sitting in Washington, Dubai, or in Europe, I think all we can do is just hope for the best, because whatever happens is going to affect the rest of the world. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. Happy to come back anytime. Congrats on the podcast.
Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.